Hello, this is Mr. Seymour again. This is Chapter 2 of our study of American government for Government 2305. The topic in your textbook for Chapter 2 is Constitutional Democracy, Promoting Liberty and Self-Government. And those are the two focuses that your author is going to take. Liberty meaning freedom, self-government meaning people having the ability to oversee and control their government rather than the government controlling them. So we're going to look at some historical and philosophical and conceptual ideas that are brought about within the text, but we're going to kind of do this from a macro approach, looking from the outside. You definitely need to very closely read your text and to get a grasp of a lot of the terminology that he's going to use and some of the concepts, because this lecture will in no way go over every single thing that's in your chapter. So you are responsible for your reading, but this should help you get a better understanding of what we're talking about in the book.
Andy?
Hi, Barney.
Look at that, would you?
What's that?
My old history book. The one I used way back in the 8th grade.
I'll be dogged.
Yeah, with all this talk with Opie about how good he's doing in school and all, I got to thinking about my own schooling and I dug that up. My old history book.
Bernard P. Fife. This book belongs to Bernard P. Fife. If lost or stolen, please return to Bernard P. Fife. Signed, Bernard P. Fife. Your book?
Yeah. Look at the next page.
A History of the United States of America by Bernard P. Fife.
Well, remember how we used to paste our own names over the authors?
Oh, yeah. Boy, you've had this a long time.
Well, since the 8th grade. And you want to know something? There's things right there in that book that I learned that I still remember to this day.
Oh, come on.
To this day. It's amazing how that stuff stays with you. Once you learn something, it never leaves you. It stays locked up tight right in the old noodle.
Does, huh?
Sure. Here, let me show you. Here, Constitution of the United States. Now, we had to memorize the preamble of that. I still remember it.
You do?
Yeah. Here, I'll show you. Hold the book on me.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
Constitution of the United States. Why don't you just give me the first word and then I'll know the rest.
Okay, we.
We.
We? We.
Are you sure?
I'm looking right at it.
Oh, we. We.
Thee.
We thee. We thee. People. We the people. We the people. We the people. We the people. Of. We the people of the
United.
We the people of the United flag. Breeze. Wind. Wave. Star.
States.
We the people of the United States.
In order
In order
to form a more perfect
to form a more perfect union. Union. In order to form a more perfect union. Establish. Establish justice.
Ensure domestic tranquility. Provide for the common defense. Promote the general welfare. and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. You want to run through that again, or do you think you got it?
I got it. You learn something, you learn it.
Well, as you saw Barney Fife back there, he is trying to remember the preamble to the Constitution. And the preamble to the Constitution is the first part of the Constitution, the part that you really should remember, the part that starts with "We the People." And we're going to talk about the preamble just a little bit later and the intended purposes of government. But let's start with some constitutional quotes. First one, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. John Adams. Well, does that mean that the Constitution was established as a set of moral rules and guides, and that all of us are supposed to live by some religious belief system? I don't necessarily think that's what Adams meant, but there are a lot of people that today that argue that we are no longer a moral or religious people, and therefore the Constitution shouldn't apply or should be changed. This is a very big source of debate today, and as you watch the presidential debates, and as you watch the candidates, especially those on the Republican side, you're going to hear arguments that relate to this quote. Second quote, we the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution, and that's Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln himself used both Congress and the courts to, in a sense, pervert the Constitution. Even the Emancipation Proclamation, many considered to be a perversion of the Constitution. The Civil War was fought over constitutional provisions, over the concept of federalism, which we'll get into in the next chapter, states' rights. But that's the quote from Abraham Lincoln. The Constitution only gives the people the right to pursue happiness. You have to catch it yourself. Benjamin Franklin. And really, that's not even in the Constitution. Where is that? In the Declaration of Independence. It replaces the part that John Locke had in his philosophy that said that men are endowed by nature with rights to life, liberty, and property. And Thomas Jefferson got really worried about that word property, so he put pursuit of happiness. So a little background on political philosophy. The three philosophers from the Enlightenment that tended to have the most influence are Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Now, Enlightenment philosophers were influenced by historical conflicts of their era and the relationship between government and the governed. They believed in natural law and a perfect state of nature. In their view, man was born into a state of nature, and that state was perfect. But with Hobbes, his state of nature was that life is nasty, brutish, and short. Men must be protected from themselves, so governments are necessary to do that. That's why we create governments, to protect each other from harm that we would do to each other. Locke, on the other hand, said that man is born with natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And Rousseau says that man is born free, yet everywhere he's in chains. Governments must be responsive to the people, or it is the obligation of the people to overthrow that government. So he was a lot more radical. All three of these philosophers will influence the American Revolution, the Founding Fathers, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. Locke is who we generally give credit to influencing the Declaration of Independence, and Rousseau and another philosopher, Montesquieu, we tend to give credit to influencing the Constitution, but also Hobbes. So we can see these philosophers along a political spectrum, and to the left you have Rousseau. Rousseau believed in a liberal democracy, direct citizen participation, a focus on protecting individual liberties and freedoms. So he really believed that men should be totally and completely free to rule themselves. Locke believed in liberal republicanism, so representative government, Citizens would select representatives, and they would focus on the protection of property rights. So he was more concerned about no one taking his property. Hobbes, on the other hand, to the right, is more authoritarian. He believed that you needed an absolute ruler with strong skills to protect the people. The people have little or no say, and he focused on security and safety. We see a lot of Hobbes today in a lot of our government policies. Now, in comparing Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, Hobbes said that people collectively agree to give up all their freedom and power to a sovereign or ruler. That is his social contract. That a man be willing when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary to lay down the rights to all things and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. He believed in absolute control, authoritarian monarchies. He really believed that there should be a strong king or leader, not elected necessarily, where all the powers and laws are by that sovereign. The government would impose the law in order to prevent the state of war. That's all Hobbes worried about, was not having war and protecting us from each other. Locke, on the other hand, said that governments exist by the consent of the people to protect their natural rights and to promote public good. The right of revolution is exercised when a government fails. People may rebel when they have redresses against the government. There is the principle of the rule of the majority, where things are decided by the greater public, and that would be a liberal or constitutional monarchy, close to what we have. Majority rules, minority rights. Rousseau was more worried about the minority rights side. Social contracts are made among all people of that society to bring them into harmony. He believed that a general will is made, and it has to be agreed on by the people to abide by it. Each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and in a body that we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. The direct rule by the people. Whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. Now, before the Constitution, let's look at some very basic colonial and revolutionary experiences. This is not a history class, so I'm not going to focus too much. The colonial experience was that we were independent with democratic institutions because we were 3,000 miles away from Europe and Great Britain. The English Parliament and the colonial charters were the law of the land. We believed ourselves to be British. However, we got to a point where after the French and Indian War, Great Britain decided they needed to raise money, so they started raising taxes. And they started to impose those taxes on the American people without any representation from them. And so we rebelled. So the rights of Englishmen, which we believed applied to us as colonists, included a trial by jury and things like no ex post facto laws, which means you could make a law retroactively, and the law of habeas corpus, which means the ability to be brought in front of a judge to determine whether or not any charges against you are valid before you're jailed. Now, when there was a Stamp Act which required that even newspapers and playing cards and marriage certificates had to have a tax paid on them. That was repealed. The Townshend Act was enacted. Tax on tea. Well, we know what happened there. We had the Boston Tea Party and the Sons of Liberty, and we get our first Continental Congress by 1775. By 1776, we get the Declaration of Independence. This was a call to revolution with Locke and Rousseau's values of liberty, equality, individual rights, self-government, and lawful power. The philosophy of John Locke is the overwhelming philosophy that influenced Thomas Jefferson in writing the Declaration of Independence. The idea of inalienable, which means they can't be taken away, which Locke called natural rights, which are life, liberty, and property. There's also that. Now, after the Revolution, we'll skip the whole revolutionary experience here. In case you didn't know it, we won. The Articles of Confederation were adopted during the Revolutionary War. The problem was that they created a weak national government and they gave all the power to the states. The states retained sovereignty, freedom, and independence. They prohibited Congress from interfering in states' commerce policies. Basically, Congress had no power to get an army, no power to raise any money. Everything was in the hands of the states. They prohibited Congress from taxation, and Congress needed the unanimous consent of the states to approve any amendment or to make any laws, really. So the national government was completely powerless, and the states, it was 13 individual little countries. And those 13 individual little countries did not get along with each other. We were not a United States. So when the representatives to the Annapolis Convention come together in 1785 and 1786, they realize that these Articles of Confederation are so badly constructed that they're not going to unify us as a nation. So the nation was dissolving, which raised fears about the weaknesses of the national government. A weakened Congress showed that we were dissolving. The farmers, led by a man named Daniel Shays, actually picked up guns and went against their creditors. They had borrowed money because they weren't being paid by the revolution during the revolution, weren't being paid by the Revolutionary Army. Washington hadn't paid them. He just gave them IOUs, and they didn't farm while they were fighting the war. So they were losing their farms to the banks, and so they actually rebelled against not just the creditors that they owed the money to, but the courts themselves. I mean, they took guns into the courts. So Congress was unable to raise an army to stop this rebellion. And this motivated Congress to authorize a convention in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. When the representatives to this convention met, they realized this isn't going to fly, this isn't going to work, and what happened was they scrapped the Articles of Confederation without authorization by their respective state legislators. They scrapped the Articles of Confederation and started building something that we call the Constitution. But the Constitution required negotiation. You had differences, northern states and southern states, large states and small states. So we get some great compromises here, some important compromises. The Great Compromise is probably the most famous of those. It creates the two-chamber Congress that we know today, with the House of Representatives representing the people and being formed on the basis of population, and then the Senate representing the interest of the states originally, and being formed on the basis of each state having an equal number of representatives. So small or large, each state got a say in the Senate equally, and larger states had more of an advantage in the House because they were represented by population. So the Virginia plan was the large state plan, where representation was based on the population, and it gave greater power to larger states. The New Jersey plan was the small state plan. Each state was going to have one vote, equal power to large and small states alike. The Great Compromise then creates this two-chamber Congress, with the House of Representatives being based on proportion of population, and the Senate having equal representation, 2 senators per state. The 3/5 compromise was an issue of slavery and trade. Congress agreed that it would not tax exports, only imports. So what the states were shipping to other places were not taxed, only what was coming into the country from other places was taxed. Congress agreed not to outlaw slavery for at least 20 years. And then we have the 3/5 compromise, which basically said that the states that had slaves could count 3/5 of that population for tax and political representation purposes. What it has come to mean to many today is that a slave was considered 3/5 of a person. It's not quite what it said, but that's what it really resulted in. So if you look here, as a percentage of state population, African American slave populations, the greatest population was down here in South Carolina, and particularly, we'll see this state was basing its commerce on rice, and then later on cotton. But the southern states, starting here with Maryland and going down, these are your southern states. They have the population of the slaves. The northern states up here had very small populations of slaves. So the northern states didn't care about slavery, they wanted to get rid of it. But the southern states wanted to have the slavery, so they were the ones that insisted on the 20-year moratorium on ending slavery, and they also are the ones that insisted on protections. For instance, a slave who fled from down here in South Carolina and moved up here to Pennsylvania would have to be returned down here to South Carolina because he was considered property, and it's in the Constitution. So, strategies for ratification. The Constitution was submitted directly to the states. They needed the approval of at least 9 states. 2 groups formed: the Federalists on one side, who were proponents, supporters of the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists on the other side, who were against a strong national government and wanted strong states' rights. And if today, we may call them Republicans and Democrats, or whatever you want to say, but really these differences still exist, with the Federalists mostly being in the northern and northeastern and maybe a few, like California, some of the western states. But in reality, the Anti-Federalists are the Midwest and in the South, and they're still around today. These arguments are still here. The ratification debate continues. The Anti-Federalists raised arguments that still echo in our politics today, that national government would be too powerful, that state self-government and personal liberties were going to be risked, that states should have state rights. We hear this every day. Now, in order to argue these things out, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay start to write a series of newspaper articles all over the country called the Federalist Papers. And in the Federalist Papers, they start to make the arguments for a federalist system and the Constitution itself. A series of opposite articles that were titled under the name Brutus actually were written by people like Thomas Jefferson, and they were the Anti-Federalist Papers who were arguing against.
Hey guys, welcome to Hip Use History. In the next few minutes, we're going to see if we can't take care of the Federalist Papers. Some really important documents in American history, so giddy up, let's go. The Federalist Papers were written by... Written by no internet. Crap, we're going to call Richie. Richie. You got to save me, brother. So, here we go. I know how to use this phone. There he is. Richie's my man. Sometimes you gotta call a southerner.
Scipio's history. Oh, let's see what that's about. Yep.
Hey, Richie, do you got a second, brother?
Yeah, just a second. Just kind of preparing for class here.
Yeah, so am I. I was trying to rip a video really quick this morning, and like an idiot, I'm kind of at a loss for words, and I have no internet. So I was wondering if you could answer a quick question?
Let's see what it is.
Who wrote the Federalist Papers, man? I know there were like 3 dudes. I can't remember a one.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, you can shut up right
I thought
now.
everybody knew that.
Shut up in your face. What's the answer?
Aren't you from New York? Yeah. James Madison. Alexander Hamilton. And John Jay.
John Jay! Oh, I feel like an idiot. Good thing that there's an edit button.
Everybody forgets that one. He's like the Ringo of the Federalist.
Yeah, that's a nice one. Oh, man. How's the YouTube channel going?
Pretty good, man, but I've got like maybe 2 subscribers. You think you can help me out here?
Oh, we'll take care of my brother from another mother. Hey, man, I'm going to get back to the video. I know you got kids coming in, but thanks a lot.
All right,
man.
and I'll get back to my lesson preparation.
All right. I'll talk to you later, okay?
All right, see you.
All right, I'm getting back. Bye-bye.
Kind of the analogy that I'd like to start off with is to understand the copper relationship between a copper.
All right, so there we go. Okay. The Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And these papers are really important in American history because they really are going to kind of seal the deal on the new Constitution. So I'm going to call them the second book of duh. The first book being Common Sense, kind of waking up the colonists. This is a book, another book of persuasion to get the Americans now living under the Articles of Confederation, kind of the chutzpah, to ratify this new Constitution. So the Federalist Papers were written between 1787 and 1788, that sweet soft spot right after the Constitutional Convention, again, in order to persuade Americans to ratify this bad boy. So following the Constitutional Convention, the anti-Feds grabbed some pen and paper and started publishing anonymous writings under the names of Cato and Brutus in some of the New York press, really bashing the Constitutional Convention, calling it like a grab for power, that this was kind of the road to tyranny. So Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay were like, no, he didn't. So they started publishing their own essays in the New York papers under the pseudonym Plubius. And that's for the Roman consul Plubius Varius Pubicola. What a cool name is that? And really, that's how it takes off, under anonymous writings in the New York papers. So some of the more famous Federalist Papers would definitely be Fed 10 by Madison, where he really talks about how a republic is going to kind of safeguard against ourselves and the concept of factions. Madison also gives a spirited defense of the concept of federalism, of the sharing of power between the federal and the state governments, where the feds reign supreme, but reserve powers exist for the state. Also in Fed 51, Madison really expands upon the idea of how checks and balances is going to safeguard liberty and make this bad boy run efficient. Now, if you look at Hamilton's more kind of famous Federalist Papers, you'd be looking at Fed 70, where he makes a defense of a one-man executive. 78, where he talks about judicial review and the importance it's going to play in checks and balances. And then Fed 84, which is kind of a weird cookie, and talks about really there not being a need for the Bill of Rights, that liberty is defended fine enough with the original Constitution with checks and balances and such. But that's okay, because now you know the answer. The Federalist Papers were written to persuade Americans to ratify the Constitution in order to not repeat the mistakes of the Articles of Confederation. So there you go. Thanks, Mr. Ritchie. Right down there, you see his website. You got to click it, and then you're going to go subscribe, and you're going to learn lots about history from Mr. Ritchie. So check out the links below. You're definitely going to find EDU gurus for all of your subjects to grow your brain twice its size. And if you haven't subscribed to Hip Hughes History, WTH, what are you doing? Do it right now. Where attention goes, energy flows. We'll see you next time, guys. Cha-ching.
So now we've got a little bit better understanding with that previous video about the Articles of Confederation, I hope, and the Federalist Papers. Framers' goals. The framers had 4 goals: to create a government that was strong enough to meet the country's needs, to create a government that would not threaten the existence of the separate states, to create a government that wouldn't threaten the liberty of the people, and to create a government that was based on popular consent. Now, we're going to look into these goals in just a moment, but let's go just a little further. All right, so this is a table that shows us our major goals: to establish a government strong enough to meet the nation's needs, which was an objective sought through substantial grants of power to the federal government. So we're strengthening the power of the federal government. This is all arguments that we're going to see when we get into federalism in the next chapter. Then, to establish a government that would not threaten the existence of the separate states, which again is through this balancing act between federal and state power, federalism, and through a Congress that would connect to the states through elections by forming a republic. Now, to establish a government that would not threaten liberty, we have an elaborate system of checks and balances. We also have this thing that we created called a Bill of Rights. To establish a government based on popular consent, which was done through the provisions for direct and indirect election of public officials. Now, where do we find the purposes of the government written down? Our founding fathers wrote down exactly what they wanted our government to do, and they wrote it in the preamble. Starts in big letters with "We the people," which explicitly places the people in charge of the government. That is the principle of popular sovereignty. In order to form a more perfect union was to correct the errors of both the unitary system of Britain and the Articles of Confederation, the Confederate system that we had, which neither one of them really worked for us. To establish justice, we get a system of courts, we get a Supreme Court and a system of lower courts, both in the states and at the federal government level. We also establish the rule of law, and then we use the Constitution itself as the center of law, making it the supreme law of the land. To ensure domestic tranquility, this was the reaction to Shays' Rebellion, and we decided that we needed to be able to react if things were falling apart. To provide for the common defense gives the federal government the ability to create the Army and the Navy. It places it under the control of the federal government with civilian oversight by the president. And we'll talk more about that in later chapters. To promote the general welfare, this is where a lot of our debates today take place. Anywhere from Obamacare to personal choice about Planned Parenthood or parental planning or abortion, the right to smoke marijuana, all these things end up, and also in arguments about welfare itself. How much assistance should the federal government give to the people, or should the states give to the people? This is a very debatable part of the preamble, but it was initially designed to give the federal government the ability to do things like regulate commerce, regulate trade if necessary, but we still believed in fair and open trade, banking, and we gave the government limited capabilities, but the government has grown in its power to do these things. And then ensuring the blessings of liberty, that's where you get the Bill of Rights, individual protections from oppressive government, and a general atmosphere of political, personal, and economic freedom. All three of those. To protect liberty, we form limited government, and we grant and deny power to the federal government, to the government. The grants of government are limit government by stating specific powers in the Constitution. I'll put a lecture up later about those powers because there's a total of 17 of them. The denials of government limit government by stating specific prohibitions, and it makes the Constitution difficult to amend, which is why it's only been amended 27 times in over 225 years. So using power to offset power, this comes from another philosopher called Montesquieu, which is the concept of the separation of powers, which is why we have three branches of government: the the legislative, which makes laws; executive, which carries out laws and enforces laws; and judicial, which interprets laws. Madison, in his Federalist 10, talks about the problem of overbearing majorities. He calls it the tyranny of the majority, and his argument was you have to counter that with a separation of powers and a system of checks and balances. So we create overlapping but separate powers. Checks and balances and separation of powers are not the same thing. Separation of powers is when you have your three branches of government. Checks and balances are when you give a little power to each of the three branches to look over the shoulder of the other. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. So our constitutional provisions of limited government start with grants of power by granting the national government powers and saying that those powers that are not granted to it are denied to it. But we have this thing called the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause, which is kind of a go-around. So we're going to talk about that a little later. Separated institutions, the division of national government's power among three power-sharing branches: executive, legislative, judicial. Each of these acts as a check on the powers of the others, so that's our checks and balances. Federalism is the division of political authority between national and state governments that enable the people to appeal to one authority if their rights and interests are not respected by the other. This is an area where most of our debates today surround federalism. Denials of power: there are powers that are explicitly denied both at the national and state level by the Constitution. Okay, expressly denied. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It specifies the rights of citizens that the national government must respect. The idea and concept of judicial review says that the power of the courts to declare government actions null and void when they are found to violate the Constitution. And this comes actually in like 1803 in a case called Marbury versus Madison. Now, elections: the power of the voters to remove officials from office, either by election, by recall in some cases. We don't have that at the federal level, but we do at some state levels. And then also through something called impeachment. Limited government: separation of powers, separate institutions sharing powers and checks and balances. The separation of powers divides powers of government. We have shared institutions who have checks and balances. They share legislative powers. Congress checks the powers of the President and the Supreme Court, and vice versa. Shared executive powers: the President is checked by Congress and the Supreme Court. The President can't do anything he wants to do. And we have shared judicial powers: the courts are checked by the President because he nominates who's going to be on the court, and Congress because they can, in certain circumstances, remove someone from the bench. But the federal judges, constitutional federal judges, serve for life unless they've done something wrong. So this chart shows you the relationship between the three branches of government and the way that your checks and balances works. It is in your book. Read it and know it. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It protects the rights of citizens by giving us such things as freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion. Telling us that we have a trial by jury of our peers. We have the right to legal counsel. We have certain procedures that must be followed when we're charged with a crime or when we're arrested. We have the freedom to assemble peaceably. And the powers of our government are limited through the Bill of Rights. This is very, very important. Judicial review is when the courts determine if governmental institutions are acting within their constitutional powers. It was established by Chief Justice John Marshall in the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803. If there's any court case you need to know in this class, I'm going to talk about Marbury probably as much or more than any other court case we study. No Marbury versus Madison. You will have questions on it on your quizzes, and I'm going to ask you questions on about it as you go along. It's the key to how the relationship between the courts, the executive branch, and the legislative branch work. So, democracy, representative government, democracies versus republic. Everybody says, well, it's a free country. It is to an extent. We are a democracy, but democracy does not mean we get this, majority rules. It doesn't also mean you get to do anything you want to. We are a democratic republic. That means that we elect people who make choices for us. The framers did not want the overbearing power of the majority. They called it the tyranny of the majority. They preferred the concept of a republic, where people would vote for representatives who would hopefully take care of their best interests. The majority rule in a republic is limited because we want to protect minority rights. So majority rule, minority rights. And that is a delicate balance that we see every day in action, especially if you look at some of the Supreme Court cases that came down over the summer. Providing for representative government will limit popular rule because people participate indirectly in the process of government. Indirect elections of the president. We do not directly elect the president. We have this electoral college. We vote for the electors. We do not vote for president. Hate to burst your bubble. Indirect, initially we had indirect election of senators. Now we have direct under the 17th Amendment. And then the federal judiciary is appointed and they serve for life. Now we have direct election of our senators, but that wasn't until the early 1900s. 17th Amendment. So, the original methods of choosing our national leaders. For president, it was the Electoral College. Term of service was 4 years. George Washington establishes the precedent of serving no more than 2 terms. For U.S. Senator, it was the state legislatures that would choose those senators for 6 years. And then we staggered the terms of the senators so that there were 1/3 of the body of senators would leave every 2 years. And we still have those staggered terms. So you're voting for senators every 2 years, but not all senators. You do vote, however, for every member of the House every 2 years. U.S. representative federal judge. The U.S. representatives by popular election every 2 years. Federal judge are nominated by the president, approved by the Senate, and they serve for life subject to good behavior. It's rare for a judge, a federal judge, to be removed from the bench. It's rare. So we also had to provide for a way to change the Constitution. Let's look at how we provided for representative government here. Jeffersonian democracy said that government belonged to all. This is Jefferson's idea, not just to the elite. Jacksonian democracy says the state give electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. And progressive democracy is where we had direct election of senators, referendums, which means we can put things on the ballot, and initiatives, and then elected officials as delegates carry out the wishes of the voters. So we've kind of changed over time from, well, the government belongs to everybody, not just the elite, but Jefferson was a member of the elite too. Jackson, we'll talk more about Jackson, but basically Jackson was that era where basically you bought your vote and you traded for your votes, and the electoral votes went to the winner of the popular vote. Direct election of senators, referendums, and initiatives, and then your elected officials as delegates, meaning they are supposed to do what we send them to Washington to do. So, how did we take measures to make government more responsive to the popular majority? Well, in the early situation, we separated powers as a means of dividing authority and blunting passionate majorities. Indirect election of all national officials except for House members, because we wanted to buffer between officials and the popular influence. And we nominated candidates for public office through political parties. We still nominate candidates for public office through political parties, but we do it in a different way. Back then, they just slapped you on the back and said, you're a nominee. Today we have primaries and it's open to the people. All right, subsequent developments. Political parties as a means of uniting authorities and linking them with popular majorities. Believe me, most of the founding fathers did not like the idea of political parties. They called them factions, but you can't get away from them. Direct election of U.S. senators and popular voting for president, but it's linked to the electoral vote as a means of increasing popular control. So you do vote for president, but it's in a different way, and we'll get to that. Primary elections as a direct means of selecting party nominees. So we have primaries, and we'll talk about the election process a little later in this course. Today, constitutional democracy is what we have. Constitutional democracy says that power is gained through fair and open elections that are to be exercised. That power is exercised in accordance with law and with due respect for individual rights. You need to know those three parts. That's what makes us a democracy today. We have institutions that gain their power through elections and through appointment, but they exercise it according to the rule of law, and they have due respect for individual rights. Democracy provides for majority influence by elections. How do we participate in a democracy? Through elections. What kind of government do we have? We have a republic, which is a mix of deliberative institutions that go back and debate back and forth to make laws, each of which moderates the power of the others. That's why you have two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, we've gone over a lot of constitutionalism, but I'm going to post another informational video that you need to do to go through the Constitution itself.